When you think of renewable energy, you probably picture clean technology. Solar farms, wind turbines, maybe even an electric vehicle. What you probably don't picture is the global race unfolding behind the scenes, a scramble for supply chain control, infrastructure dominance, and the geopolitical leverage that comes with determining who leads the next era of energy.
All right, moving right along here, going to go through the various types of renewable energies existing on the current market, as well as new emerging ones. In no particular order, starting out here with solar, this uses panels to turn sunlight into electricity, one of the fastest growing renewables, and the costs continually drop. This works almost anywhere from rooftops to giant solar farms. Next is wind. This uses turbines to generate energy from moving air, one of the cleanest and cheapest energy sources used today, offshore wind especially being the most powerful and consistent. Next up is geothermal. This pulls heat from deep underground. It's super steady and low emission. This is great in areas with active geothermal activity, so think Japan. Hydroelectric, one of the most reliable and the backbone of clean energy for decades. This uses moving water to spin turbines, so think Hoover Dam. Tidal, very similar to hydroelectric, however, it uses ocean tides instead of existing rivers to generate that electric power. Now, this is in its early stages and needs coastal infrastructure to help support it. Lastly, here we have nuclear fusion technology, not to be confused with fission. So this tries to replicate the energy process of the sun. If successful, could provide limitless clean energy. Very experimental with progress improving. Now, how does this impact international finance, especially in regards to the US? Our renewables funding has fallen by 36% in 2025 due to policy shifts from the Trump administration. This has led to capital moving overseas to Europe and Asia for more stable policies in their renewable sources, meaning global investment is being led by China and those advanced economies as opposed to the US, which means we are at risk of losing over $1 trillion in US GDP by 2035 if these rollbacks continue to happen. Now, solar and wind will always remain globally strong, but the emerging tech sector, especially in the US where a lot of startups are based for these renewable projects like tidal and nuclear fusion, this will have a tremendous impact. Now, which of these is the most promising? I believe it's solar, wind, and nuclear fusion. Solar, the prices have continued to drop year over year. Technologies become easier to produce and it's more readily available on the general market. I'm sure most people know someone who uses solar in their homes or have seen solar farms out in the area. There's one in Billerica, massive. Wind, by far the most common and cheap form of renewable. Large amounts of energy. Like I mentioned earlier, offshore projects make the prospect more promising, allowing for more consistent, large amounts of energy production. And finally, nuclear fusion. It's a very long-term project, but it has the potential to provide virtually limitless energy as long as the reaction is able to be sustained. Moving on to renewable energy projects, I just mentioned offshore wind. This is the Revolution Wind Project. This is just off the coast of Martha's Vineyard near Rhode Island and Connecticut, produced by Ørsted and Eversource. Will provide energy to over 350,000 homes across Rhode Island and Connecticut, and it will help show the potential of U.S. offshore wind. Now, it was stopped by the Trump administration this year due to some sort of cuts by Doge. However, a recent judge ruling has just allowed it to continue. It should be done by next year. It's going to be 65 offshore wind turbines and one of the highest density wind areas in the country. Now, moving on here, we have the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, or ITER, in France. This is the world's largest fusion experiment. China also has one, but this is backed by 35 countries, including the US. Its goal is to produce more energy than it consumes, and it just recently had a 22-minute-long sustained reaction. Now, people who aren't familiar with this would know that it is very hard to sustain a reaction, so for 22 minutes, very impressive.
So, now that we've covered what these renewable technologies actually are, we need to talk about something less visible, the global race happening behind them. Because the real struggle in renewable energy isn't about the solar panels or the wind turbines themselves. It's about who controls the minerals, the supply chains, and the infrastructure needed to build them. And this is where the new geoeconomic conflict begins. Okay, so regarding supply chain and mineral proxy conflicts, every renewable technology depends on a handful of minerals, and control over those minerals is becoming one of the most important sources of global power. 3 minerals in particular define this new competition: lithium, cobalt, and nickel. Lithium. Lithium is the foundation of almost every modern battery. Most of the world's lithium comes from the lithium triangle: Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. And China has spent years securing mining rights, refining capacity, and long-term supply contracts there. The US and Europe, meanwhile, still heavily rely on imports, which means that they're dependent on supply chains they don't control. On to our next mineral, cobalt. Cobalt is even more concentrated. Over 70% of the world's cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where mining is directly connected to ongoing conflicts and humanitarian crises. China controls the majority of industrial cobalt mining and almost all refining capacity.
Hapa tuishi shetena donc tunarete selon nani Mwah. Iba mwisha nene unamletea maibui. Anakwambia c'est 0%, mais anakwambia sipandisha kule kurish. Kule kuma 13%. Anaipandisha kule. Mashaka bana kutia Louis 14 wamuleta. Utamfanya nini? Tupa na teso.
So even when Western companies want quote-unquote ethical cobalt, it still flows through Chinese processing, which has shown to be anything but. On to nickel. Nickel is essential for high-performance EV batteries. Indonesia has some of the world's largest reserves, and a few years ago, they banned raw nickel exports. Why? To force companies within Indonesia to refine instead. China immediately stepped in with billions of dollars in investment, building smelters and industrial zones. As a result, China now controls a huge share of global nickel processing. And once again, the US ends up indirectly dependent on Chinese-backed supply chains. Now, I would be lying if I said that there wasn't another half to the story. There's also a global race to build infrastructure that moves this energy around. Things like transmission lines, battery factories, grid systems, and even entire renewable mega projects. China is currently leading with its Belt and Road Initiative, financing and constructing solar farms, hydroelectric dams, transmission networks, and battery plants across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So what we're actually seeing is a new kind of proxy conflict, not military, but in geoeconomic terms, built on minerals, refining, and infrastructure power, which brings us to the United States, and a decision that dramatically affects our position in this global race.
The first thing I want to talk about is the Big Beautiful Bill and how it actually relates to renewable energies. The first part I want to touch on is how parts of the bill are designed to reduce our reliance on Chinese components, although we don't currently have the necessary domestic production in order to substitute it. This is also coupled with the fact that we're restricting access on materials essential to renewable energy production foreignly. This, coupled with the fact that it also eliminates electrical vehicle, solar, and wind tax credits. And within the next 10 years, it aims to cut $500 billion in renewable energy support. Although it's all not bad news, it does retain nuclear subsidies as well as geothermal. But why does this actually matter? Well, the financial impact can be broken into 3 different parts: short term, medium term, and the long term. Short term, there's going to be cuts in federal spending on renewable energies. There's going to be an increase in fossil fuel productions and the jobs related to that. And there's also going to be higher consumer prices for solar panels as there are no more tax cuts. The next part I want to talk about is the medium term. This is where there's going to be reduced private investment in renewable energies as some of these incentives to do so are disappearing. And we're going to lose U.S. competitiveness in comparison to China, especially in renewable energies, as our means of production just isn't as advanced as they are. And we're going to become more reliant on fossil fuels. Long term, this is going to put us in a little bit of a decline as economic leaders in the energy markets, as we'll be kind of ceding to China. And speaking of which, I want to talk very briefly about how China is actually taking the lead in renewable energies. China is actively looking for new talent to help with the research, and one way that they achieve this is through programs like the 1,000 Talents, which promises job security that the U.S. can't compete with, especially after the Big Beautiful Bill, and how that can affect the amount of jobs available due to companies deciding they don't want to continue their searches anymore due to lack of funding.
Regardless of the country, the future hinges on energy. In international finance, whoever controls energy shapes current account balances, trade deficits, capital flows, and ultimately currency values. Renewables aren't just about climate. They're about who gains or loses economic leverage. And the nations that dominate renewable supply chains will define not just the energy landscape, but also the global financial architecture going into the next century. So, in conclusion, China is currently leading in infrastructure and in supply chain control. And from where we sit in the US as business and finance students, the outlook honestly isn't that great. To put it colloquially, yeah, we might be cooked. But the final whistle hasn't blown yet, and the global energy race is still far from over. The United States still has renewable projects going strong, and from what I've heard from my contacts at NREL and in industry, the current political headwinds are merely hurdles to jump through for our steadily growing renewable energy sectors. And if there's one thing that history has shown repeatedly, it's that the United States tends to move slowly, until it moves all at once.